And we are in Luke chapter 6 this week in our Bible reading. And looking at this text, Jeff, really we have three main sections. So as you try to wrap your mind around Luke chapter 6, look for these three segments in the chapter. First of all, verses 1 through 11, what links those together are the Sabbath controversies, right?
Right, absolutely. And I think one of the big picture things you keep in mind when you read Sabbath controversy stories, and you see this in every gospel that deals with them, Mark and Matthew as well, is that the Sabbath, Jesus uses the Sabbath really as kind of the real point of what God created man for, this rest and restoration and salvation, and therefore it's meant to be a blessing, not a burden. Whereas they've turned it into a burden, and that's where Jesus keeps on challenging them. And so, as you read those stories, you want to reflect upon what Jesus is trying to say about understanding the purpose of God in the world. What's He really trying to accomplish? And as much as He's healing withered hands and whatnot, it goes far beyond just that. What the Sabbath really means in terms of God and man's relationship.
The other interesting thing I thought about as I was looking at these first 11 verses is that each of the two Sabbath controversies say something about Jesus
Yes.
too.
Yep.
So you have the first one where he says, oh, and by the way, the Lord of the Sabbath.
Right.
I'm the one in charge of the Sabbath, which carries huge implications when you
Right.
stop and begin to ponder that. And then, though not explicitly stated, as in other accounts, you do have this clear implication that he forgives sins.
Yeah.
Also saying a lot about him
right.
in the second one. So watch for that as you go through these first 11 verses. Now, the second segment is verses 12 through 19, and that's where he finally finishes the work that actually began a couple of chapters
Right.
back, where he's putting together his team. And so we have,
Right.
the selection of the 12.
That's right. That's right. It's Jesus's picks there, and I think the interesting thing about that, one of the things that Luke does here that the other Gospels don't, is he drops that hint that these will be apostles. He named them apostles in verse 13. That's unique in the Gospel accounts. No other Gospel calls them apostles already. Luke, of course, going into the book of Acts, his second volume where they become the apostles, Luke's already hinting even more strongly than other Gospel accounts. Keep an eye on these 12. Jesus is going to do something great with them.
And as an aside, I wanted to mention that verse 12 mentions how he goes off on the mountain to pray before
right.
he does that, only because we continue to encounter these references to the prayer life of Jesus
Right.
and that quiet devotional time he took, which intersects what we're trying to do with the reading this year. Carve out this time to be alone in the Word and to commune with God through study and prayer. So the Lord saw that was important. We should see that as important too. The last segment, and by far the larger segment,
Right.
is beginning at verse 20 and going through verse 49.
The rest of the chapter.
That's exactly right, is this sermon that he's going to deliver. So we have this lengthy collection of his teachings that sound really, really familiar. I think when people read it, they're going to think Sermon on the Mount.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And the thing there is, I think actually you can usefully compare the Sermon on the Mount with this sermon and notice some of the similarities and some of the differences. Just like when you preach the same sermon twice, David, like you did this morning.
Like I did this morning. That's right.
Sometimes
two different crowds,
same
sermon.
But it's funny. We do that sometimes, right? You and I, we preach the same sermons to different crowds, sometimes in gospel meetings and whatnot, and you can sometimes make the same points in different ways or use the same ideas, but nuance them a little bit different for perhaps a different crowd. And so I think reading those two accounts against each other can be useful, but especially because Luke's a little bit different, it allows us to read some of those same old familiar teachings with fresh eyes, I think. Wrestle with Luke's account of some of Jesus's teachings to this setting, and perhaps you'll notice and see some things with new eyes in a new way.
And always remember as we work through these sections that obviously first we want to understand the text and how the text connects together. But this is a great opportunity to make the point that the teaching is meant to be applied.
That's right.
And so we need, once we understand it, to look for ourselves in here and to ask, what does this passage say to me? Maybe it's a great challenge to give your kids this week. Have them read it and ask them, how does this chapter speak to you? What challenges do you see that this teaching speaks to, where Jesus tells you what it is that his will is for us? So spend some time not just considering, but also applying the great teaching that's in this chapter. And we hope you enjoy your reading of Luke 6.